They laughed first, not quietly, not behind closed doors, but openly, loudly, with the kind of confidence only armies at war seemed to have. In the muddy rear areas behind the trenches, officers shook their heads, veterans smirked, and younger soldiers repeated the joke until it became doctrine. That ammunition will never work here. In a war defined by mud, barbed wire, and bodies packed into narrow trenches, the idea of using a different type of ammunition sounded absurd, almost insulting to everything they thought they understood about combat. Why would anyone abandon what already worked? Rifles had rules. Bullets had traditions. For decades, armies believed that accuracy at distance and disciplined volleys won wars. The trenches only reinforced that belief. You fired down narrow corridors of death, waited for movement, conserved ammunition, trusted standard-issue rounds designed for open fields and long sight. Anything else felt reckless, amateur, dangerous to your own men. So when this new ammunition appeared, it became a punchline. Too unconventional, too aggressive, too focused on close-range destruction. Critics said it wasted resources. Others argued it violated the unwritten code of warfare. Some even claimed it was a sign of desperation, proof that whoever adopted it had run out of real solutions. In mess halls and dugouts, soldiers joked that it belonged in hunting cabins, not on the Western Front. Laughter echoed louder than curiosity. But the trenches were not battlefields of tradition. They were pressure cookers, tight spaces, blind corners, sudden encounters measured not in hundreds of meters, but in steps. 10 meters could decide life or death. 5 seconds could end an entire assault. And while doctrine clung to theory, reality kept stacking bodies against the trench walls. Here is the uncomfortable truth they refused to see. Trench warfare had broken the old rules. Rifles designed for long-range precision were awkward and narrow corridors. Reloading under fire was slow. A single missed shot could mean a bayonet in your chest. Every assault turned into chaos the moment soldiers crossed the parapet and dropped into enemy lines. Combat became brutal, intimate, and fast, and standard ammunition was never designed for that world. Still, the laughter continued. Officers dismissed reports from the front as exaggerations. Training manuals stayed the same. Command believed discipline would overcome any tactical inconvenience. They always believed that. History is full of examples where institutions defend familiarity even as it fails them. And in the trenches, familiarity was killing men quietly, day after day. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not during a grand offensive, not announced in a communique. It happened in the mud, during a routine assault that was supposed to look exactly like the last one. Huisol's blue soldiers climbed ladders. Machine guns opened fire. Men fell. Survivors pushed forward and dropped into enemy trenches, expecting the usual close-quarters nightmare. But this chimney, something was different. The sound changed first. A deeper, more violent echo, ripping through enclosed spaces. Not the sharp crack of rifle fire, but a concussive roar that bounced off trench walls and dugouts. Then the effect followed. Enemies didn't just fall. They vanished from the fight. Positions cleared in seconds instead of minutes. Resistance collapsed before it could organize. Soldiers froze, unsure of what they were facing, unsure of how to respond. Those who had laughed were suddenly silent, because in the trenches, fear spreads faster than orders. When word traveled down the line that a new kind of ammunition was being used, something designed for the trenches, not adapted to them, morale shifted instantly. The enemy began hesitating before counterattacks. Patrols avoided certain sectors. Whispers replaced confidence. The same ammunition that had been mocked now carried a reputation heavier than artillery. And the men who carried it noticed something else. For the first time, the trench felt less like a death trap and more like a weapon. What they didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning. The laughter had ended, but the consequences were just starting to unfold. This ammunition wasn't just changing firefights. It was about to rewrite how close combat in war would be fought forever. If this moment made you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew about trench warfare, now is the time to engage. Understanding why this ammunition worked and how it shattered old military assumptions is what separates surface-level history from real insight. These stories are not just about weapons. They are about decisions, arrogance, fear, and innovation under pressure. Take a second and leave a comment telling us what surprised you most so far. Was it the resistance to change, the brutality of trench combat, or how fast laughter turned into fear? Your comment helps push this story further and keeps these overlooked moments alive. And if you're finding value here, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe. Every like and subscription tells YouTube that deep researched military history like this deserves to be seen. To understand why that ammunition became the terror of the trenches, you have to step away from the battlefield for a moment and look at the problem no one wanted to admit out loud. Trench warfare was not just a tactical challenge. It was a design failure. Weapons, ammunition, and doctrines were built for wars that no longer existed. And the trenches exposed that gap with brutal clarity. Traditional rifle ammunition was designed for open terrain, long engagement distances, and clearly defined lines of sight. On paper, it was perfect. Flat trajectory, predictable ballistics, efficient use of materials. But inside a trench, those advantages turned into weaknesses. Shots were rarely taken beyond a few dozen meters. Targets appeared suddenly, often partially concealed. Engagements happened at angles, through gaps, around corners, inside dugouts. Precision mattered far less than immediate stopping power. Engineers and forward-thinking officers began noticing a disturbing pattern. Soldiers were firing multiple rounds at close-range targets with standard ammunition and still losing the fight. Enemies kept charging. Bayonets still closed the distance, even when hitchy attackers had enough momentum to kill before collapsing. In the chaos of confined spaces, that delay was fatal. That is where the idea of different ammunition emerged, not as an experiment, but as a necessity. The goal was simple but controversial: maximize effect at extremely short range. Instead of prioritizing long-distance accuracy, this ammunition focused on energy transfer, spread, and immediate in other words, it was designed to end fights instantly, not politely. The logic was brutally pragmatic. In a trench, there was no room for second chances. A single hesitation could wipe out an entire section. Clearing a trench was not about marksmanship medals. It was about shock, speed, overwhelming force in the first seconds of contact. This ammunition was built for that reality, even if it made traditionalists uncomfortable. What made it even more controversial was how it challenged military culture. Armies pride themselves on discipline and standardization. Deviating from issued ammunition meant questioning decades of training. It meant admitting that manuals were outdated, and worst of all, it meant accepting that previous losses might have been avoidable. That kind of admission is never easy for institutions built on authority. So, instead of embracing the idea, command structures resisted it. Reports were dismissed. Field feedback was watered down. The ammunition was labeled niche, situational, unnecessary. On paper, they were right. On paper, wars were still fought in lines across open fields. But paper did not smell like mud, blood, and cordite. Meanwhile, soldiers at the front understood immediately. Those who handled the ammunition noticed how differently it behaved. The recoil felt heavier. The sound was more violent. Impacts were unmistakable. Enemies stopped moving instantly instead of stumbling forward. Dugouts were cleared faster. Counterattacks stalled before they gained momentum. In a place where fear was constant, certainty became a weapon. This is where the irony deepens. The ammunition was never meant to replace standard rounds entirely. It was meant to complement them, a specialized solution for a specialized problem. But specialization was seen as weakness by commanders who believed uniformity meant control. They underestimated how much the battlefield had changed. As more units quietly adopted the ammunition, patterns began to emerge. Assaults succeeded more often. Casualty rates dropped in close quarters engagements. Enemy reports described confusion and panic. Something was happening beneath the surface, something command could no longer ignore, and that raised a dangerous question for everyone involved. If this ammunition worked so well in trenches, why wasn't it standard already? The answer threatened careers, reputations, and long-held beliefs about how wars were supposed to be fought. That question would soon force its way to the surface, not through debates or reports, but through combat results that were impossible to dismiss, because the trenches did not care about doctrine. They only rewarded what worked. Before we continue, leave a comment with one word that best describes trench warfare in your mind: chaos, fear, brutality, or something else entirely. Your response helps shape how this story reaches others. The first real test did not happen during a carefully planned offensive or under controlled conditions. It happened the way most turning points in trench warfare did: suddenly, violently, and without warning. A routine operation, a familiar sector. Command expected the usual outcome: heavy resistance, slow progress, high casualties, and a fight that would blur into dozens of others on the map. No one expected the ammunition itself to become the decisive factor. The assault began like countless others. Artillery softened the enemy line, churning the mud and collapsing sections of trench, but leaving most of the underground network intact. When the barrage lifted, infantry moved forward, climbed down into enemy trenches, and immediately collided with the nightmare every trench soldier knew too well: blind corners, narrow passages, smoke, screams, and enemy soldiers appearing at arm's length. This was where plans usually collapse. In past assaults, this moment turned chaotic within seconds. Soldiers fired, missed, reloaded under pressure, or hit targets that kept moving anyway. Bayonets came into play. Grenades bounced unpredictably. Entire sections stalled because one or two defenders refused to go down fast enough. Momentum died in cramped spaces where hesitation meant death. But this chimney, the rhythm was different. The first shots echoed through the trench with a sound that didn't match expectations. Louder, heavier, the blast reverberated off wooden supports and packed earth, amplifying the effect. Enemy soldiers didn't stagger or fall backward. They dropped instantly. Others froze, shocked by what they were hearing and seeing. The usual rush to counterattack never fully formed. Within moments, positions that normally took minutes to clear were silent. Soldiers pushing forward felt it immediately. There was no uncertainty after pulling the trigger. No second-guessing. No need to fire again at the same target. Every engagement ended decisively, and that decisiveness changed behavior on both sides. Attackers moved faster. Defenders hesitated. The trench itself, usually a maze of resistance, began to feel fragile. What made the effect even more unsettling was how quickly it spread. Soldiers further down the line heard the unfamiliar reports and the sudden absence of sustained fighting. Messages moved along the trench faster than any runner could carry them. Something was wrong. Something was different. Fear thrives on uncertainty, and uncertainty had just entered the trench system. Enemy troops attempted to regroup, but the usual tactics failed. Charging around corners became suicidal. Holding choke points no longer guaranteed safety. Dugouts that once provided cover turned into traps. The ammunition was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: dominate confined spaces with overwhelming effect. By the time officers realized something unusual was happening, the damage was done. Sections that should have held were gone. Counterattacks collapsed almost immediately. Prisoners were taken who couldn't clearly explain what had hit them, only that it was fast, brutal, and impossible to fight against at close range. After the assault, the reactions were telling. The soldiers who carried the ammunition spoke with a mix of relief and disbelief. For the first time, trench clearing felt survivable. Not easy, not safe, but possible. They described a strange confidence, knowing that the first contact would not spiral out of control. That confidence translated into speed, coordination, and fewer mistakes. Command, however, reacted cautiously. Reports were toned down. Language was softened. Words like effective replaced devastating. No one wanted to sound alarmist or admit that an unconventional choice had produced results. Standard doctrine couldn't. But numbers don't lie for long. Casualty figures told their own story. Sectors where the ammunition had been used showed dramatically different outcomes, and the enemy noticed too. Intercepted communications revealed confusion and fear. Units requested reinforcements for areas that had already fallen. Patrols avoided certain trench sections entirely. Something had shifted psychologically. The trench was no longer just a defensive structure. It had become a liability. This single engagement didn't change the war overnight, but it planted a dangerous idea in everyone's mind. What if this ammunition wasn't an exception, but the future of trench combat? What if the laughter had been hiding a fatal mistake? That question would soon force commanders to confront reality, whether they wanted to or not. The moment the laughter truly died was not recorded in official reports. It didn't appear in medals or communiques. It happened quietly, in the space between one engagement and the next, when enemy soldiers began to realize that the trenches no longer behaved the way they were supposed to. At first, it was subtle. Attacks slowed. Counterattacks hesitated. Patrols that once probed aggressively now moved cautiously, stopping more often, listening longer. The enemy still held the trench lines on paper, but something invisible had shifted inside them. Confidence was draining away, replaced by doubt. Then came the stories. Survivors spoke of assaults that ended almost immediately, of comrades who disappeared in seconds, of dugouts that had always been safe suddenly becoming death traps. They described a sound that didn't belong, deeper, heavier, echoing unnaturally through narrow corridors, a sound that seemed to follow them even after the fighting stopped. In trench warfare, silence is terrifying, and this ammunition created silence faster than anything they had faced before. Enemy officers tried to impose order. They blamed poor discipline. They blamed panic. They blamed exhaustion. But none of that explained why positions that had resisted for months were collapsing in moments. None of it explained why seasoned veterans were refusing to move forward after the first contact. Soon, the reports grew harder to ignore. Entire trench sections cleared with minimal resistance. Counterattacks aborted almost immediately after starting. Units requesting reassignment away from specific sectors, not because of artillery or gas, but because of what awaited them underground. The trenches, once symbols of protection, had turned against their occupants. This is where fear became operational. Soldiers stopped clustering in dugouts. They spread out, reducing effectiveness. They avoided choke points, weakening defensive cohesion. They delayed responses, giving attackers precious seconds to consolidate gains, all because of a weapon they could not fully understand and could not reliably counter, and that fear spread faster than any assault. Trench systems were connected by communication tunnels, supply routes, shared units, rotating in and out of sectors. Men talked. Whispers traveled at night. A single story passed through dozens of mouths, growing darker with each read. Even soldiers who had never encountered the ammunition began to anticipate it. Anticipation is where terror lives. Commanders attempted to restore confidence by downplaying the threat. They issued reassurances. They emphasized discipline. They promised countermeasures were being developed. But fear doesn't respond to speeches. It responds to experience. And experience was telling soldiers that the old balance of power inside the trenches was gone. Some units tried aggressive responses, launching preemptive assaults to regain initiative. These failed disastrously. Others adopted defensive postures, pulling back deeper into trench systems, surrendering ground inch by inch. Either way, momentum belonged to those using the ammunition. What made this shift so devastating was its speed. Psychological dominance usually takes months to establish. This happened in weeks, in some sectors days. The trench environment amplified everything: sound, fear, rumors, and turned them into weapons. By the time enemy command acknowledged the problem openly, the language had changed. The ammunition was no longer dismissed as unconventional. It was labeled dangerous, unpredictable, a threat requiring immediate attention. The laughter was gone, replaced by urgency and, beneath it, panic. But recognition didn't mean solutions, because acknowledging the problem forced a harder question: how do you defend a trench system against something designed specifically to dominate it? The enemy would soon discover that adapting was far more difficult than mocking had ever been. Inside the trenches, physics mattered more than theory. Space was limited. Angles were unforgiving. Every wall, beam, and sandbag shaped how violence unfolded. This was where the different ammunition revealed its true nature, not as a gimmick, but as something brutally optimized for an environment that punished hesitation. Traditional rifle rounds behaved predictably in open terrain. In trenches, they did not. Bullets overpenetrated, passing through targets and burying themselves uselessly in dirt walls. Misses ricocheted unpredictably. Shots that should have ended a fight often failed to stop it fast enough. In close quarters, even a half-second mattered, and standard ammunition was wasting time. Soldiers did not have. The different ammunition changed that equation immediately. At close range, its effect was overwhelming. The moment it struck, the fight ended. There was no stagger, no return fire, no second movement. In trench corridors, barely wide enough for two men to pass, that kind of certainty transformed how a source unfolded. Clearing a trench became faster, cleaner, and far less chaotic. Soldiers no longer had to pause, reassess, or fire again. Momentum stayed intact. That momentum was everything. Trench warfare depended on rhythm. Once attackers lost forward motion, defenders recovered. Machine guns came back online. Grenades appeared. Counterattacks formed. But this ammunition denied defenders that recovery window. Each engagement collapsed before it could escalate. Sections that once required multiple grenades and sustained fire were neutralized with a handful of shots. The physical layout of trenches amplified the effect. Blast and impact reverberated through wooden supports and packed earth. Sound traveled farther and felt closer than it was. Soldiers deeper in the trench felt shock waves before they heard shots. That sensory overload disoriented defenders who hadn't even been engaged yet. Confusion spread faster than commands. Dugouts, once safe havens, became liabilities. Confined spaces magnified the ammunition's effect, turning cover into traps. Defenders hesitated to retreat into shelters that could be cleared in seconds. Some refused outright, choosing exposed positions over enclosed ones. This broke defensive patterns commanders relied on to hold the ground. There was another consequence few anticipated. Attacker behavior changed completely. Soldiers carrying this ammunition advanced differently. They took corners aggressively. They moved with purpose instead of caution. Confidence replaced fear in those first critical seconds of contact. That confidence reduced mistakes, reduced friendly casualties, reduced hesitation. In combat, belief in your equipment can be as lethal as the equipment itself. Meanwhile, defenders experienced the opposite. Every corner became a question mark. Every shadow felt dangerous. The physical destruction was bad enough, but the unpredictability was worse. You couldn't brace for it. You couldn't reliably counter it. The trench stopped. Feeling familiar, and familiarity is what keeps soldiers functional under stress. Attempts to reinforce trench structures failed. Extra sandbags, thicker timber, deeper dugouts, none addressed the core problem. The ammunition was not about penetration alone. It was about dominance in confined space. The trenches had been designed to protect against artillery and long-range fire, not against something built specifically to kill at arm's length. By this point, the physical reality was undeniable. The trenches themselves had become outdated, turned against those who relied on them. A system designed to protect soldiers was now amplifying their vulnerability. That realization hit command slowly, but when it did, it was devastating. Because if the trenches could no longer protect their occupants, then the entire logic of static warfare was cracking. The physical damage was only half the story. What truly turned this ammunition into the terror of the trenches was what it did to the human mind. Trench warfare already pushed soldiers to the edge of psychological collapse, but this weapon introduced a new layer of fear, one that could not be reasoned with or trained away. Fear in the trenches usually followed patterns. Artillery meant chaos. but also predictability. Machine guns were deadly, but their positions could be mapped. Even grenades followed a rhythm. Soldiers learned these dangers, adapted to them, and survived by understanding their limits. This ammunition shattered that sense of understanding. It arrived without warning and ended fights instantly. Defenders no longer had time to react. There was no moment to shout a warning, no chance to return fire, no opportunity to rally. Men simply vanished from the fight, and those nearby were left staring at the aftermath, unsure of what had just happened. That uncertainty poisoned morale faster than casualties ever could. The sound played a critical role. In narrow trenches, echoes distorted direction and distance. Soldiers could not tell where shots came from or how close the attackers were. A single discharge could sound like multiple weapons firing at once. Even experienced veterans began misjudging threats, reacting too early or too late. Panic crept in quietly, then took over. Sleep became impossible. At night, every noise felt amplified. Footsteps, shifting earth, a dropped tool. Soldiers lay awake, waiting for a sudden, overwhelming engagement. They knew they would not have time to survive. Anticipation wore them down faster than combat itself. Men entered engagements already exhausted, already shaken, already defeated in their own minds. This psychological pressure changed behavior in dangerous ways. Some soldiers fired prematurely, revealing positions. Others hesitated entirely, freezing at the worst possible moment. Defensive coordination broke down as individuals focused on personal survival rather than unit cohesion. Orders went unheard. Signals were missed. The trench stopped functioning as a system. Commanders noticed the symptoms before they understood the cause. Increased desertions. Rising reports of combat fatigue units requesting rotation far earlier than expected. Medical officers documented stress reactions that appeared disproportionate to actual time under fire. Something was accelerating psychological breakdown. What made it worse was the lack of a visible enemy. This ammunition did not announce itself with barrages or massed assaults. It struck suddenly and locally. Soldiers could not point to a specific threat and say, "That is what we are facing." The fear became abstract, omnipresent, impossible to escape. Rumors filled the void. Stories grew darker as they traveled. Some claimed the ammunition could clear an entire trench in seconds. Others said it could kill through walls. None of this was entirely true, but truth mattered less than belief. Once soldiers believed the trench itself offered no safety, their fighting spirit eroded rapidly. Even hardened veterans were affected. These were men who had endured months of shelling, gas attacks, and close combat. Yet many admitted privately that this was different. It felt personal, immediate, final. You didn't fight it. You endured it, and endurance has limits. The psychological imbalance became strategic. Units under this pressure reacted slower, defended poorly, and made mistakes attackers could exploit. Battles were won before they fully began, not through firepower alone, but through fear shaping decisions. This is when military leaders finally understood the real danger. The ammunition was not just killing soldiers. It was breaking formations, dissolving discipline, and eroding the will to hold ground. And fear, once unleashed, does not stay contained. That realization forced the enemy to act not with confidence, but with desperation. Desperation drives innovation, but it also exposes limits. Once the enemy accepted that this ammunition was reshaping trench combat, they moved quickly to find countermeasures. Orders were issued. Experiments followed. New drills were rushed into the field, but almost every response revealed the same uncomfortable truth. The trenches were no longer defensible in the way commanders believed. The first attempt was structural. Trenches were reinforced with thicker timber, additional sandbags, and deeper dugouts. The logic was simple. If the environment amplified the weapon's effect, then altering the environment might reduce it. In practice, this backfired. Tighter spaces increased pressure and confusion. Heavier reinforcements trapped sound and shock even more effectively. What was meant to protect soldiers instead magnified the terror. Next came tactical adjustments. Units were instructed to spread out, avoid clustering, and abandon traditional choke point defenses. This reduced immediate casualties, but it destroyed coordination. Trenches rely on density to function. When soldiers spread, thin gaps formed. Gaps invited rapid penetration. Assaulting forces exploited these weaknesses with speed, cutting through sections that should have held. Some commanders attempted aggressive counterattacks, believing that initiative would neutralize fear. They ordered sudden pushes into contested trenches, hoping to overwhelm attackers before the ammunition could be used effectively. These attacks failed almost immediately. Close-range engagements favored the very weapon they were trying to avoid. Losses mounted, and morale collapsed faster than before. Others tried technological solutions. New equipment was issued. Protective gear was modified. Experimental shielding was tested. None of it addressed the core problem. The ammunition was not something you could block easily or predict reliably. It thrived on proximity, surprise, and confined space, the defining characteristics of trench warfare itself. Training manuals were rewritten in haste. Soldiers were instructed to listen differently, react faster, retreat sooner. But training cannot overwrite instinct under extreme stress. When contact happened, soldiers reverted to survival behavior. And survival behavior under this kind of threat meant hesitation, withdrawal, or panic. Perhaps the most revealing countermeasure was silence. Some units attempted to avoid engagement entirely, pulling back quietly, abandoning sections of trench without a fight. This slowed immediate losses, but surrendered ground rapidly. The battlefield began shifting not because of overwhelming force, but because defenders no longer trusted their positions. At higher levels, intelligence officers struggled to classify the threat. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't a new rifle. It didn't fit existing categories. That made it difficult to justify radical changes in doctrine. Admitting the truth meant admitting the trench system itself had been compromised, and that was the real failure. Every countermeasure treated the ammunition as the problem. None addressed the environment that allowed it to dominate. Trench warfare had created conditions where this weapon thrived. As long as those conditions existed, no defensive fix would fully work. By the time this became clear, options were running out. Casualty reports continued to climb. Morale continued to erode. Commanders faced a choice they had avoided since the war began: adapt completely or lose control of the battlefield. That decision would not come easily, but it would come quickly. Because when desperation meets undeniable results, doctrine always breaks. Before we move on, leave a comment with one word you think defines desperation in war. Adapt, resist, or collapse. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. Military doctrine rarely collapses under debate. It collapses under numbers, casualty lists, failed defenses after action reports that all point in the same direction. And as those reports accumulated, the resistance that once fueled laughter began to evaporate. Commanders who had dismissed the ammunition as unnecessary now found themselves requesting it quietly, then urgently. What had been labeled experimental became situationally appropriate. What had been mocked became mission critical. Language soft first. Orders followed later. The change started at the lowest levels. Platoon leaders began asking for the ammunition before assaults. Company commanders adjusted loadouts without waiting for formal approval. Units that had access to it were assigned the most difficult trench-clearing tasks. And when those tasks succeeded more often, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Doctrine began to bend. Assault tactics were rewritten around speed and shock rather than methodical advance. The goal shifted from clearing trenches section by section to collapsing resistance before it could organize. Fire teams were restructured. Roles changed. The first seconds of contact became the decisive phase of battle, not the prolonged exchange that manuals had emphasized for years. This represented a fundamental change in how close combat was understood. Previously, trench warfare was seen as attrition, a slow grind where endurance mattered more than surprise. The ammunition flipped that logic. Surprise regained its value. Shock became the primary weapon. Assaults were designed to overwhelm immediately, not exhaust gradually. The trenches stopped being static defenses and became contested spaces that favored aggression. Higher command adapted reluctantly but decisively. Supply chains were adjusted to prioritize production. Training programs were updated, not publicly, but in practice. Instructors emphasized aggression in confined spaces, rapid movement, and decisive first contact. Soldiers were taught to trust the weapon and push forward rather than pause. Confidence was engineered deliberately. The most telling change was psychological. Commanders who once feared the ammunition's brutality began to see it as humane, not because it was gentle, but because it shortened fights. Shorter fights meant fewer drawn-out engagements, fewer panicked counterattacks, fewer unnecessary losses. In war, efficiency often masquerades as morality. Opposing forces noticed immediately. Assaults became faster. Defenses collapsed sooner. The tempo of battle changed. And tempo is everything. Once you lose control of tempo, you lose the initiative. And once you lose initiative, even well-prepared positions fall. This rapid doctrinal shift exposed a hard truth. The ammunition had not changed the battlefield alone. It had revealed how fragile existing doctrine already was. The trenches had demanded adaptation for years. This weapon simply forced the issue. And as adoption spread, something unexpected happened. The ammunition stopped being controversial. It became normal. Another tool. Another standard. The laughter was forgotten, replaced by urgency and routine. But normalization has consequences. When innovations are absorbed quickly, their origins are often erased. Credit fades, context disappears, and the brutal lessons that forced change risked being lost again, waiting to be relearned in the next war. That forgotten legacy is where this story turns next. What followed was not celebration, but silence. As the ammunition became standard practice, its disruptive origin began to disappear from memory. Official histories focused on campaigns, generals, and strategic movements. Manuals were rewritten without footnotes. Innovations that once sparked controversy were absorbed so completely that they stopped feeling new. This is how military history often works. What shocks at first becomes routine, and what becomes routine stops being questioned. The ammunition that had terrified the trenches was no longer discussed as a turning point. It was simply listed as equipment. Issued, used, replaced, forgotten. The brutal debates that surrounded its introduction vanished from official narratives, replaced by clean timelines and simplified explanations. The human cost of resisting innovation rarely fit neatly into after-action summaries. Part of this erasure was intentional. Acknowledging the impact of the ammunition meant acknowledging how wrong leadership had been. It meant admitting that thousands of casualties occurred under outdated assumptions. That kind of admission rarely survives peacetime reflection. Safer stories take its place, stories about courage, endurance, and inevitability, rather than miscalculation. Another part of the forgetting came from speed. Wars move quickly. New weapons emerge. New doctrines replace old ones. What once felt revolutionary becomes obsolete within a few years. By the time the war ended, attention had shifted elsewhere. Tanks, aircraft, radios, the trenches themselves faded from focus, taking their lessons with them. But among the soldiers who had been there, the memory never fully disappeared. Veterans remembered the moment the balance shifted. They remembered how suddenly the trenches felt different, how fear changed sides, how confidence returned, not through speeches, but through results. These memories lived in personal accounts, letters, and quiet conversations, not in textbooks. There was also discomfort. This ammunition forced an uncomfortable moral reflection. Its effectiveness came from how decisively it ended fights in confined spaces. Some saw that as merciful. Others saw it as excessive. That tension made it easier to avoid the subject entirely. History often prefers clean victories over complex realities. As decades passed, the trenches became symbols rather than places. Mud and barbed wire replaced by monuments and ceremonies. The granular details of how soldiers actually survived inside those spaces faded. Innovations that challenged the romanticized image of endurance were sidelined. Yet the lesson remained hidden in plain sight. Innovation in war rarely looks elegant. It often looks wrong at first, unrefined, uncomfortable, laughed at. And when it works, it exposes failures that institutions would rather forget. That is why these stories vanish, not because they are unimportant, but because they are inconvenient. The ammunition's legacy survived quietly in in urban combat, in room-clearing tactics, in weapons designed for confined environments. Its influence spread far beyond the trenches, even as its origin story disappeared. And that raises a final, unsettling question. How many other innovations were ignored, mocked, or delayed simply because they didn't fit existing beliefs? That question brings us to the final lesson this story leaves behind. The real lesson was never about ammunition alone. It was about how wars are actually won and lost long before maps change or flags move. The trenches exposed something armies have always struggled to admit. Tradition can be deadlier than the enemy when it refuses to adapt. What begun as laughter was not ignorance. It was certainty that the old rules still applied, certainty that experience mattered more than observation, certainty that doctrine, once written, should not be questioned by those closest to the fighting. That certainty cost lives. This ammunition did not succeed because it was exotic or brutal. It succeeded because it acknowledged reality. The reality that trench combat was intimate, chaotic, and unforgiving. The reality that close-range encounters demanded different tools, different thinking, and different priorities. The reality that survival depended on ending fights immediately, not elegantly. The moment armies accepted that reality, everything changed. Tactics shifted from endurance to dominance, from holding ground to seizing momentum, from reacting to shaping the fight before it fully began. And once that mental shift occurred, the trenches stopped being static graves and became contested spaces, where initiative mattered again. This lesson extends far beyond trench warfare. Every major conflict produces its own version of this story. A weapon, tactic, or idea dismissed because it does not fit existing frameworks, mocked because it challenges authority, ignored because it forces uncomfortable self-reflection, and then, suddenly, it works. When it does, the laughter disappears, replaced by urgency, rationalization, and eventually silence. What makes this cycle dangerous is how predictable it is. Innovation rarely announces itself politely. It arrives imperfect, disruptive, and often in the hands of those without institutional power. Those closest to the problem see it first. Those furthest from danger resist it longest. The trenches proved that distance from the battlefield breeds confidence, while proximity breeds clarity. The ammunition became a terror, not because it was unstoppable, but because it revealed how fragile existing systems were. The trenches were never invincible. They only appeared that way until something was designed specifically to break them. Once broken, they could never be trusted the same way again. And that is the part history tends to smooth over. Wars are not changed by grand ideas alone, but by small decisions made under pressure. Decisions to listen, to adapt, to abandon pride before it becomes fatal. The soldiers who survived understood this instinctively. The institutions learned it reluctantly. That lesson still echoes today in every conflict where new environments demand new thinking. When innovation is mocked, when unconventional ideas are dismissed, the question is never if reality will respond, only when and at what cost. This story does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with a warning. The next terror of the battlefield will not look impressive at first. It will look wrong, and somewhere, someone will laugh right up until it works. If you stayed with this story until the end, it means you understand something most people miss about war, innovation, and history. So now, take a moment and leave a comment with the phrase adapt or fall to show you made it all the way through and truly grasped the lesson behind these events. Make sure to like this video. That single action helps these hidden military stories reach more people who care about real history, not simplified versions of it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. New stories like this, filled with forgotten tactics, ignored innovations, and moments that changed warfare forever, are coming next. Before you go watch the next video appearing on your screen, it connects directly to this story and reveals another moment where something mocked at first reshaped the battlefield in ways no one expected. You're not just watching history, you're keeping it alive.